Greatest question in the Bible is this: what will you do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?
For more than 60 years, Pastor John Hagee built one of the most powerful ministries in America, a church of 20,000 members, television in 99 million homes, books on the New York Times bestseller list. But behind that empire, something has been quietly falling apart. Old sermons keep resurfacing. Donors are asking questions about his lifestyle. Critics who stayed silent for decades are finally speaking out. At 85 years old, the preacher who once stood next to presidents is now facing the kind of scrutiny he spent a lifetime avoiding. And what's coming out is worse than anyone expected. John Charles Hagee was born on April 12, 1940, in Goose Creek, Texas, a refinery town that later became part of Baytown near Houston. He was the second of 4 sons born to William Beitel and Vada Hagee, and from the start, church life surrounded him. Both of his parents were deeply involved in Pentecostal ministry, and he came from a long line of preachers that stretched back for generations. His father founded Assemblies of God, churches, in Channelview and Houston, then later pastored Glad Tidings Assembly of God in Corpus Christi. So for young John, church was never just something the family attended. It was the center of everything. By the time he was 5, people in the congregation already knew him as Johnny, the pastor's boy who stood in front of adults and sang every week. He grew up in the Channelview area while his parents led First Assembly of God, and his early life moved between strict religion and the ordinary rhythm of a small Texas town. There was school, there was church, there was sports. His father had little interest in athletics, but John loved competition and kept pushing forward anyway. At Reagan High School in Houston, he built a reputation fast. He became a National Honor Society student and earned varsity letters in 4 sports. Football became his strongest path, and he rose to team captain. His grades stayed high, his leadership stood out, and before long he earned something few teenagers could dream of: a commission to the United States Military Academy at West Point. It was the kind of future that promised rank, discipline, and a clear road ahead. Then everything changed in one night. On the second Thursday of January 1958, 17-year-old John sat on the back pew of his father's church in Houston during a revival service. Up to that point, he had quietly planned to leave church behind once he was old enough. He had sports, he had West Point, he had a future that seemed already mapped out. But during the altar invitation that night, he later said he felt an overwhelming call. In a single moment, years of ambition gave way to something else. He got up from the back row, walked to the front, publicly gave his life to the Lord, and accepted what he believed was a call into full-time ministry. Before he even turned 18, the road he had imagined for himself was gone, and a new one had opened in front of him. The next morning, he made the choice real. He withdrew from Reagan High School, even though his grades were strong and his athletic future looked bright. He did not wait to finish the year. He did not stay for the safe ending everyone expected. Instead, he enrolled immediately at Southwestern Bible Institute in Waxahachie, Texas, an Assemblies of God school that was later known as Southwestern Assemblies of God University. In less than 2 days, his life had turned completely. His classmates were still thinking about senior year, football, and prom. He was already 250 miles away, living in a dorm room and stepping into a world shaped by chapel services, theology classes, and ministry training. That new life was not glamorous. It was demanding from the start. On the first Sunday of March 1958, only weeks after enrolling, Hagee preached his first sermon at his father's church in Houston. It was not a small youth talk or a practice message. It marked the beginning of his public life as a preacher. During the week, he sat in class and studied. On weekends, he traveled wherever small churches would have him, preaching revival meetings and building experience one service at a time. He also joined the school's Harvester Choir, which toured churches to sing and promote the college, filling long days with travel, music, and ministry. Money stayed tight, so he worked in a church furniture factory to support himself. By day, he handled pews and pulpits. By night, he stood behind them. Even before turning 20, he was already living the grind of work, study, and preaching all at once. As those early ministry years unfolded, he kept moving forward. In 1962, after years of preaching on weekends, he aimed higher in his education and secured a full athletic scholarship to Trinity University in San Antonio as a football walk-on. That mattered because his tuition was covered through sports, not through theology. He was still a preacher in the making, but he was also proving himself in the classroom and on the field. At Trinity, he completed a Bachelor of Science degree in History and Education, graduating in the summer of 1964. His schedule stayed full. He balanced classes, football, and the identity he had already begun to build as a young evangelist. The image of him was becoming clearer now. He was not simply the pastor's son who had answered an altar call. He was a disciplined student-athlete with growing confidence and a very public sense of mission. After Trinity, he moved into coaching at Nimitz Middle School in the Northeast Independent School District. There, his teams in football, track, and basketball all won district championships. Success followed him, and for a while, it looked like he could have built a strong career in education and athletics. But once again, he kept pressing into something bigger. In the fall of 1965, he enrolled at North Texas State University and pursued a master's degree in educational administration. He finished it by 1966. That part of his story matters because it set him apart from many pastors of his generation. He did not stop with Bible college. He added graduate-level training in leadership and administration, and that would later shape the way he built institutions, managed people, and expanded his work far beyond a single pulpit. Even before those degrees were finished, he had already thrown himself into evangelism. While studying at Southwestern in the late 1950s, he spent most weekends on the road, preaching revivals wherever doors opened. During the week, he studied. When he was not in class, he worked to cover his expenses. Then, after graduation, he moved fully into evangelism and kept traveling through the early 1960s instead of settling into one congregation. Those years mattered because they sharpened the style that would later define him. Constant travel taught him how to hold a room, how to build momentum in a sermon, and how to speak in a way that pushed people to react. The revival circuit shaped him long before he became known in San Antonio. By 1966, at just 26 years old, he was ready to stop traveling and build something permanent. In October of that year, he founded Trinity Church in San Antonio, his first independent congregation. It was a major step. He had a stable path in education behind him, a fresh master's degree, and every reason to choose security. Instead, he stepped into the risk of building a church from the ground up. Trinity Church began in a modest setting, but it grew quickly. Within 6 years, the original space was no longer enough. By 1972, the congregation had expanded enough to move into a larger sanctuary. That growth showed something important about Hagee very early. He was not content to maintain. He wanted to build. Then came another sharp turn. In May 1975, Hagee resigned suddenly as senior pastor of Trinity Church, less than a decade after founding it. For people who had watched the church grow, the decision was surprising. Yet instead of moving toward a more established platform, he did something even more unexpected. He took over a struggling congregation of about 25 people in Castle Hills, a suburb of San Antonio. He stripped away the old identity and renamed it the Church. On paper, it looked like a smaller stage and a harder path. In reality, it became the foundation for everything that followed. During this fragile period, his personal life changed too. In 1976, 1 year after leaving Trinity Church, and beginning again in Castle Hills, he married Diana Castro, now Diana Hagee. The timing mattered because the marriage came while the new congregation was still small and uncertain. Membership was counted in dozens, not thousands. Still, he kept pushing for growth. He preached multiple services, expanded ministries, and steadily shaped the church into something much larger than the tiny fellowship he had taken over. Step by step, the second marriage and the second church began to define his public image. That rebuilding effort led to another transformation in 1987. The congregation, which had first grown beyond its storefront roots as Castle Hills Church, moved to a much larger campus on San Antonio's north side and took on a new name, Cornerstone Church. The new setting reflected much bigger ambitions. It had room for a massive sanctuary, large parking areas, television production, and major conferences. Over the years that followed, Cornerstone claimed more than 20,000 active members, making it one of the largest churches in Texas. The shift was dramatic when measured against where he had restarted in 1975. A congregation of 25 people had turned into a powerful religious institution with regional and national influence. As the church expanded, so did the media side of his work. By the early 2000s, the ministry had become a major operation. Through global evangelism television, known as GATV, and through John Hagee Ministries, his sermons were being broadcast on more than 160 television stations and 50 radio stations, reaching around 99 million homes worldwide. The local preacher had become a media figure. Investigations and filings later pointed to the scale of the money involved. Reports from the early 2000s described the Hagee enterprise as bringing in more than $18 million in revenue in a single year, with personal salary and benefits that drew close scrutiny. That part of the story added another layer to his rise. He was no longer simply a pastor with a large church. He was leading a religious brand with national reach and serious financial power. His public profile kept growing through books and media. By 2018, press releases were describing him as a New York Times best-selling author, with nearly 40 books to his name. Several of those titles reached the bestseller list, including 4 Blood Moons and Absolute Power. Industry profiles placed his total output somewhere between 34 and 40 books, with 7 making the New York Times list. That kind of writing career gave him a second platform beyond the pulpit. His books were not sold as isolated ideas. They were part of a larger conservative Christian identity that included preaching, television, conferences, and politics. By 2020, descriptions of his work often referred not just to a church, but to a media empire. Then, in 2011, he moved into yet another lane. He released a Southern gospel album titled A Lifetime of Music Through Difference Media. The project featured guest appearances from the Oak Ridge Boys, Bill Gaither, his son Matthew Hagee, and the family group The Hagees. It tied music directly into the ministry brand he had already built. The album even received 2 GMA Dove Award nominations, including Southern Gospel Recorded Album of the Year and Southern Gospel Recorded Song of the Year for Victory in Jesus. That moment showed something consistent in his career. He kept finding new ways to widen his platform and deepen his public presence. At the center of much of his preaching was a message about wealth and prosperity. In sermons such as The Power to Get Wealth and The Decision to Prosper, he quoted Deuteronomy 8:18 and told listeners that it is God's will for them to prosper. He pushed the phrase, "givers gain," and connected Luke 6:38 to the idea that giving money would lead to material blessing. In that framework, financial increase was not random. It was tied to generosity, obedience, and faith. He also described poverty as a curse and taught that people did not qualify for God's abundance until they gave. That message became one of the most debated parts of his ministry because critics argued that he was using Scripture to support a system of fundraising built around promises of blessing and return. Those criticisms grew sharper around his use of what many called seed theology. Watchdog ministries and online critics focused especially on the way he used Luke 6:38 and Deuteronomy 28 in fundraising appeals. They argued that these passages were being applied in ways that pushed people to believe financial offerings would produce miracle returns. In that reading, giving to the ministry became a path to wealth, healing, or breakthrough. Critics pushed back hard, saying the verses were being removed from their original context and turned into tools for money appeals. Supporters heard promise and encouragement in those sermons. Opponents heard manipulation. The disagreement became part of his larger reputation. Questions about money also followed him personally. Some online commentators in 2025 claimed his net worth was around $50 million and framed that wealth as built through donor giving. Other estimates from secular and Christian outlets placed it much lower, usually around $5 to $6 million, based on salary, book royalties, and ministry income. Earlier investigative work had already noted that before restructuring part of his nonprofit operation in 2004, he was among the highest-paid nonprofit executives in San Antonio, with annual compensation close to $1 million for limited weekly hours connected to the nonprofit side of his work. Whether the estimates were high or low, the pattern was clear. The ministry had grown into a machine with major revenue, and people noticed. His support for Israel was deeply tied to his end-times theology. He taught that the modern state of Israel was central to God's plan for history, and often described it as the stopwatch for what would happen to nations, including the United States, until the rapture. In his 2006 book, Jerusalem Countdown, he argued that conflict involving Israel, especially a future clash with Iran, would trigger the Gog and Magog battles from Ezekiel 38 and 39 and move the world closer to the return of Jesus. He also warned that policies he believed weakened Israel could bring judgment. For him, these were not just political disagreements. They were prophetic events with eternal stakes. That apocalyptic focus brought him wider attention. National media often described his support for Israel as driven by prophetic expectation, rather than ordinary foreign policy concerns. Reports highlighted his belief that specific valleys in Israel would become the site of the final battle before Christ's return. He spoke about coming wars, divine intervention, and a sequence of global conflict that would end with the second coming. This was not a side note in his theology. It was a major engine behind his message and public activism. He also linked present-day events to those prophetic beliefs. In October 2014, during a time when Ebola dominated headlines, he warned on his broadcast that America was moving toward judgment because of pressure on Israel, especially over Jerusalem. He pointed to the outbreak as possible evidence that judgment had already begun. In his view, American policy toward Israel did not simply affect diplomacy. It carried spiritual consequences for the nation itself. That message strengthened his appeal among supporters who shared his worldview, while also alarming critics who saw it as dangerous and extreme. That same theology helped him build strong alliances and also drew serious concern. Wealthy political donors and powerful conservatives found common cause with his unwavering pro-Israel stance. QFI events honored figures such as Sheldon and Miriam Adelson, showing how theology, money, lobbying, and political strategy had become closely connected in his world. By 2015, QFI claimed 2.2 million pro-Israel households, and Hagee openly warned Republican candidates that many of those voters would make decisions based heavily on Israel policy. Yet many Jewish voices pushed back, arguing that his agenda treated Jews as part of a Christian end-times script, rather than valuing them on their own terms. That tension stayed with him as his influence kept growing. In the late 1990s, John Hagee gave a sermon that would follow him for years. While preaching from Jeremiah 16, He focused on the line about God sending many fishers and then many hunters to drive Jews back to Israel. From there, he made the remark that stunned critics and never really disappeared from public memory. He said God sent a hunter, then added that Hitler was a hunter. He described a hunter as someone with a gun, someone who forces you. Hagee's message was that the Holocaust happened because God allowed it, since bringing Jews back to the land was, in his words, God's top priority for the Jewish people. That interpretation horrified many people because it seemed to treat Nazi mass murder as part of divine purpose, instead of naming it plainly as genocide and evil. That was not the only reason people accused him of anti-Semitic thinking. In other comments, Hagee was documented saying Hitler came from a line of what he called accursed, genocidally murderous half-breed Jews. He tied that claim to Esau's descendants and built a religious story around the idea that Jewish suffering came through rebellion and disobedience toward God. In that framework, persecution was not simply something done to Jews by violent regimes. It became something explained through Jewish failure. For Jewish writers and scholars, that line of thinking sounded painfully familiar because it echoed old Christian ideas that blamed Jews for their own suffering while pushing Nazi ideology and state violence into the background. Even some people who supported Hagee's politics admitted that these statements were disturbing and easy to read as openly anti-Semitic. The pattern became even darker when Hagee brought Jewish banking families into his end times teaching. In books and television sermons, he repeated claims that the Rothschilds stood at the center of a private network controlling the Federal Reserve and global finance. He folded that image into a prophecy story about the Antichrist, global control, and a coming one-world system. For critics, this was not some harmless theory floating at the edge of religious speculation. It drew from one of the oldest anti-Semitic myths in circulation, the fantasy that Jewish bankers secretly run the world. Modern economic research gives no support to that idea, and central banks are not private kingdoms ruled by one family. Still, Hagee kept using that language in a prophetic frame, which made many people feel that old prejudice was being dressed up as Bible teaching. By May 2008, those old sermons were no longer buried in the past. On May 21st, during the U.S. presidential race, audio of the Hitler sermon resurfaced on political blogs and cable news. The next day, Senator John McCain rejected Hagee's endorsement in public and called the comments deeply offensive and indefensible. That moment mattered because McCain's campaign had first welcomed Hagee's support as a way to reach evangelical voters. Once reporters started digging through the older sermons on Hitler, Catholicism, and the Holocaust, the political cost became too obvious to ignore. Jewish groups said the episode revealed something larger than one scandal. To them, it showed how extreme apocalyptic theology had moved close to the center of Republican politics by 2008. The same history returned in force on November 14, 2023, after Hagee was invited to pray at the March for Israel rally on the National Mall following the Hamas attacks of October 7. That event was supposed to be a public stand against antisemitism and in support of Israel. Yet almost immediately, Jewish writers and commentators brought back the Hitler sermon and the half-breed Jews' remarks. Many of them said putting Hagee on that stage was a moral disgrace. The anger was not just about something old that people had forgotten. Critics pointed out that his conspiracy language about Jewish bankers and the Antichrist had continued well into the 2020s. So this did not feel like a faded controversy from another era. It felt current. That same sense of long-running controversy shaped the wider story around Hagee for decades. He did not only provoke outrage over Jews and prophecy, he also built a reputation through attacks on Catholics, Muslims, women, and gay people. And each part of that record fed the next. For years, he preached that the Catholic Church was the great whore, an apostate church, the Antichrist, and a false cult system. These were not stray remarks tossed out once and forgotten. They showed up in sermons and writings going back to the 1990s. He linked Catholicism to centuries of antisemitism and even suggested a spiritual connection between the Catholic Church and Nazism. Catholic leaders and activists pushed back hard, saying this was far beyond normal theological disagreement. By 2008, the controversy had become so serious that it turned into a national political problem. Then, under heavy pressure in May 2008, Hagee sent a letter dated May 12th to Catholic League President Bill Donahue. In it, he expressed deep regret for comments Catholics had found hurtful. The Catholic League accepted the letter and declared the matter closed. For a moment, it looked like a full stop. Hagee insisted he had never been anti-Catholic, and later said some remarks had been taken out of context or misunderstood. Even so, his earlier statements stayed in circulation, and critics never stopped pointing to them. So the apology may have lowered the political heat, but it never erased the record. His remarks about Islam caused the same kind of uproar, and in some ways, the reaction was even sharper. In a 2006 interview on NPR's Fresh Air, Hagee told Terry Gross that those who live by the Quran have a scriptural mandate to kill Christians and Jews. That was an enormous claim because it treated Islam itself as violent by nature, instead of drawing any clear line between extremists and ordinary Muslims. He repeated similar ideas elsewhere, saying the Quran commands Muslims to kill Jews and Christians. Critics called this plain Islamophobia because it squeezed a huge global faith into a prophecy-driven story about holy war. The language did not leave much room for nuance, and that was exactly why it kept causing outrage. His culture war preaching reached women too. Hagee promoted a strongly patriarchal view of family life and taught that women were meant to be mothers and bear children, making domestic life their main purpose under God. For many critics, that message reduced women to a narrow role and treated public life, work, and ambition as something suspect. It fit neatly with the rest of his worldview, where feminism, reproductive rights, and changing gender roles were all signs of rebellion against divine order. That is why feminist writers and many Christians saw these teachings as more than old-fashioned. They believed he was turning women into second-class believers from the pulpit of a huge church with a television audience that stretched far beyond San Antonio. His apocalyptic language could become even more inflammatory when different prejudices merged into one sermon. In one case, he said the future Antichrist would be homosexual and partially Jewish. He also returned to the claim that figures such as Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx were half-breed or partially Jewish. Alongside that, he pushed ideas about Jewish financiers helping prepare the world for the Antichrist. Jewish organizations and commentators condemned all of this as classic anti-Semitic material wrapped inside Christian Zionist language. The contradiction stood out clearly to many observers. Hagee presented himself as a fierce friend of Israel while repeating themes that recycled some of the oldest hostility toward Jews. This habit of giving disasters a prophetic meaning showed up in his public statements about national tragedy too. On September 18, 2006, in an NPR interview, Hagee said Hurricane Katrina was the judgment of God on New Orleans. He argued that the city had reached a level of sin that offended God and pointed to a planned gay pride parade that was expected around the same time the storm struck. That framing outraged many people because Katrina had killed more than 1,200 people. To describe such devastation as divine punishment sounded cruel to critics, especially when survivors were still living with grief, displacement, and loss. Instead of offering comfort, he gave the disaster a moral lesson, and that choice defined the backlash. The same pattern appeared again in 2014. In November of that year, Hagee said Barack Obama was one of the most anti-Semitic presidents in U.S. history. The Anti-Defamation League responded by calling the remark offensive and misplaced. That response mattered because the ADL is usually strongly supportive of Israel, so it was not an organization eager to dismiss concerns about anti-Semitism lightly. Hagee later tried to clarify that he meant anti-Israel rather than anti-Semitic, but by then the original wording had already spread. The damage was done, and the comment became another example of how easily he moved from political disagreement into explosive accusation. Just weeks earlier, in October 2014, he had linked the Ebola outbreak to U.S. policy on Jerusalem. Hagee said there were grounds to believe judgment had already begun because Obama had tried to divide Jerusalem. That leap was striking. A deadly public health crisis in West Africa became, in his telling, a message from God about American diplomacy. Critics said this was exactly how his worldview worked. Real suffering was pulled into a prophecy framework until disease, disaster, and politics all looked like signs from heaven. Once that lens was in place, almost any event could be turned into a warning. When people step back and look across these episodes, a pattern becomes hard to miss. Katrina became punishment for New Orleans. Ebola became punishment tied to Israel. Political criticism turned into spiritual crisis. His message did not usually stop at ordinary commentary. He gave events cosmic meaning and placed them inside an end-times script. That was why so many critics said he was doing more than preaching politics. He was retelling the world as prophecy. The controversies around theology and public rhetoric were only part of the story. Money became another major point of scrutiny. In 2001, Global Evangelism Television, the nonprofit media arm of Hagee's ministry, reported more than $18 million in revenue on its IRS Form 990. That was already a huge figure for a San Antonio-based religious broadcaster. What drew even more attention was Hagee's compensation. His total package came to nearly $1.25 million for that year. Critics highlighted the details because he received about $540,000 as president of Gee TV, another $302,005 from Cornerstone Church, plus $4,135.61 in extra benefits, including retirement contributions. Those numbers placed him among the highest-paid nonprofit leaders in the area. That financial profile lined up with his preaching style. Hagee often tied giving to supernatural reward and told viewers that income is controlled by giving and that there is no such thing as a fixed income in the kingdom of God. Critics said this created strong pressure on struggling believers. In that environment, donations were not presented as simple acts of faith or generosity. They became the path to debt relief, healing, promotion, or financial breakthrough. Former followers and online critics described appeals where offerings were connected to promises about mortgages, illness, and sudden change in fortune. For them, this sounded like classic seed faith pressure, where the burden quietly fell on people who could least afford it. That criticism grew stronger when people looked at how he used Scripture. In a sermon highlighted by a 2025 online exposé, Hagee read Deuteronomy 28, the chapter about covenant blessings on Israel, and applied those promises directly to modern donors. He quoted lines about being blessed in the city and blessed in the field, then tied them to the act of sowing money into his ministry. Evangelical critics said that move ripped the passage out of its original setting and turned ancient covenant language into a personal financial contract. In their view, an offering became something closer to a transaction than worship. That interpretation only deepened concern over the way wealth was talked about in his ministry. Then there was the question of lifestyle. Some commentators have estimated Hagee's personal net worth at around $50 million, combining church income, media earnings, and years of book sales. The San Antonio Express-News reported that his retirement trust included a 7,969-acre ranch near Brackettville, Texas, valued at about $2.1 million, with 5 lodges, a gun locker, a skeet range, and several barns. Critics held up those details against New Testament images of apostles living with hardship and uncertainty. To them, the contrast was sharp enough on its own. A preacher promising financial blessing from the stage also appeared to be living inside extraordinary comfort. Politics eventually wrapped around all of this. In November 2021, Cornerstone Church hosted a stop on the Reawaken America tour, a hard-right political event featuring figures such as Michael Flynn and Alex Jones. Video from the church sanctuary showed hundreds of attendees shouting, "Let's go, Brandon," the coded insult aimed at President Joe Biden. The chant came from the stage through the church sound system, which made the event look less like a vague overlap between faith and politics, and more like open partisan theater. The Freedom from Religion Foundation urged the IRS to investigate whether the gathering crossed the line for a tax-exempt church. Critics said the church had turned itself into the setting for a campaign-style rally. By this point, Hagee was also dealing with age and health. On October 4, 2020, Matt Hagee told the congregation at Cornerstone Church that his 80-year-old father had tested positive for COVID-19 after the virus was detected early. He tried to reassure people by saying John Hagee was receiving extremely good medical treatment and was healthy enough to be upset with his doctors. Even with that attempt at calm, the news hit hard because his age made the danger obvious. Reports from that period said he spent at least 2 weeks under hospital-level care before returning to the pulpit in mid-November 2020. By 2023, write-ups about his condition described a man in his early 80s dealing with heart-related issues, visible signs of aging, and the strain that comes from decades of travel and ministry. Even so, those same reports stressed that he continued to preach regularly and remained under medical supervision while working. That image stayed consistent with the public role he had built for years. He did not step quietly into the background. He kept appearing on stage and on television, pushing ahead even while age and health became part of the story. At the same time, Cornerstone Church had already begun to move into a new phase. The church John Hagee founded in 1987 was entering a slow succession process, with Matt Hagee increasingly presented as the lead pastor, while John remained the founding pastor and symbolic center of the ministry. That arrangement allowed the elder Hagee to keep preaching and making major appearances while the day-to-day weight of leadership shifted toward the next generation. It was not a sudden handover. It felt gradual, visible, and carefully managed in real time. Then, on November 14, 2023, the whole history seemed to circle back on itself. John Hagee appeared at the March for Israel rally in Washington, D.C., and his presence instantly revived the old arguments about Hitler, prophecy, antisemitism, Islamophobia, and the kind of political protection powerful religious figures often receive. Critics said his invitation undercut the very message the rally claimed to defend. Supporters saw something else, a longtime champion of Israel standing in a moment of crisis. That split reaction captured the larger story of John Hagee almost perfectly. For decades, he has been able to remain influential while carrying controversy right beside him. And every time the spotlight returns, the same old record rises with it.